All right, thank you all for joining us today. So we're going to be doing an advanced webinar. So this kind of assumes that you are already, that maybe you've been to a talk of ours, or you've seen our introduction webinar, or you're just familiar with the Gateway to Global Aging data and some of the international family of health and retirement studies. If you're not, you're welcome to ask a question throughout, but this webinar is really geared to people who have a little bit of knowledge already about these data sets and are really looking to for more information about how to do cross-country analysis. We're going to be using Stata for this webinar. If at any time you'd like to ask a question, feel free to in GoToWebinar to type a question in chat or comment. You can also pose a question, or you could raise your hand with the raise hand button, and I will unmute you, and you could ask a question that way. I also mentioned, so there's two handouts. There's a handout called Advanced Webinar Part 1, harmonizedcharles.doc, and Advanced Webinar Part 2, crosscountry.doc. I'll put these on screen so that you can see these. And these are actually .do files. So if you've downloaded them, you could save them, and then you just want to change that extension from .doc to .do for a Stata program. And so you'll be able to use those. If you don't want to follow along on your own, that's absolutely fine. I'll be showing everything on this screen. And if at any time you want to do this afterwards on your own, we'll have these programs available to you on our website on the Gateway to Global Aging data under the documentation page. So let's get started. So the agenda for today, and I plan for this to run maybe about an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions, is we're going to go through a sample analysis using the harmonized Charles. Briefly, if you don't know, Charles is the Chinese health, aging, and retirement longitudinal study. And harmonized, it means that we're going to be using kind of a very user-friendly version of that data set, which we create at the Gateway to Global Aging data. And we'll talk about how to create that on your own machine. And then we're going to be doing some cross-country analysis using the harmonized Charles data set, which we created in step 1, and pairing that with the RAND-HRS data. All the harmonized data sets that we provided the Gateway to Global Aging data are meant to be kind of directly comparable to the RAND-HRS, which is a very friendly, user-friendly version of the HRS data, and that's the health and retirement study that's conducted out of the University of Michigan that looks at the retirement population here in the U.S. So let's get started. So analysis using harmonized Charles. So we're going to pose a research question, and the question is going to be, are there gender differences in cognition, and are these differences consistent across age groups? So we're going to talk a little bit about what cognition measures we'll be using here, and then we're going to look at some age groups. This is work that's already been done here. You can see the paper cited below by Lee, Smith, Sun, and Zhao in the Journal of Economics of Aging in 2014. So we're going to kind of be doing a sample analysis, kind of a reproduction of their work, and then we're going to expand that work by saying how are those differences compared to the U.S., and that's in part 2. So here are the steps that we need to go through for the first part of our analysis today. So we need to create the harmonized Charles dataset. We need to identify those variables that we want to consider in our analysis. We might need to create some additional variables. We need to apply weights so we can have population estimates. We'll talk about weighting. And then we can analyze cognition across genders, and we'll analyze cognition across gender and age groups. So let's talk about how to create the harmonized Charles dataset. So I'm going to go to our website, the Gateway to Global Aging data. That's available at g2aging.org. And to kind of to download the files needed to create the harmonized Charles, you are going to have to sign in. So I'm going to log in. If you haven't created a username and password, I suggest that you register with us. It's very simple. You just tell us some basic information about your research interests and kind of what where your affiliation is, whether that's a university or a research center. And then once you have access, you can log in and you have access to all of the Gateway to Global Aging data. So if we click on our download tab here at the top, you can see here we have all the studies again. So today we're going to be looking at Charles, which is here in this column second to the left in our first step, and then comparing Charles in China to the HRS here in the United States. You can also see that we have harmonized data sets also for Mexico, England, a European data set that includes Israel, Korea, Japan, Ireland, and India. So there's a lot of things. We're just going to be focusing on 2 data sets here. So the first step is that we need to actually download the Charles data. And in general, on the Gateway to Global Aging data, we don't distribute the data sets ourselves. Those data sets are distributed by the organizations who run them or who distribute them, and you have to sign up for those individually. So we can click link to download survey data here for Charles. So as we go into Charles, we can sign in to Charles. And you can see here we're going to be using data from wave 1 of Charles, and you'll need data from wave 2 of Charles. Also, signing up with Charles is very quick. It's an immediate sign up, so you can gain access. And then once we're signed in, you're going to want to download from wave 2 this all data set in one zip file. So you can download that and then unzip it. In my computer, I've got this, I've already got this downloaded, and I've got here in my C drive, I've got a folder called Charles, and I have here wave 1, and I've got here our zip file, and I've unzipped it already. So I've got all the files that were included in that zip file for wave 1, and then also wave 2. So I've got all those files here from the zip file for wave 2. I've also created a folder called HCharles, which is where you can delete this right here. So this is where the harmonized Charles data set that we're going to create, where we can store that. So I've got that. So let's say I've gone through, I've now downloaded my Charles data. So let's jump back to our website. And then, so to download the harmonized data, you'll see there's a note called See Data Code below. Here's the harmonized Charles data code. So we can click on that. And then we can download the harmonized Charles data creation code. So what this is one Stata file that you'll just edit a few lines. You can see here we have instructions. So you just have to edit 3 lines to list the folder locations for your own computer. And then you can run this once, and this will create the harmonized Charles. So you could download this. We'll get the harmonized Charles log. We could open this up directly in Stata. We'll bring it over here. So this is what this looks like. And then again, the only lines that we need to edit are these first 3, 16 through 18. So I'm just going to put in the locations that I have here. So we have C drive, Charles, wave 1. That's where my wave 1 data. C drive, Charles, wave 2. That's where I put my wave 2 data. And then I need to say where I want to save the harmonized Charles data set. You only have to run this program once because we'll save the data set for you. Also, if Stata isn't your preferred statistical package, you can always create it in Stata and then use a program like Stat Transfer or using some of the codes for specific programs to read it into SAS or SPSS that you might be familiar with using. So this is C drive Charles, and I think we call this H Charles. Let me check, make sure I've got that right. Wave 1, wave 2, H Charles with an underscore. All right, I've got that all right. We can save this, and then we can run it directly. We'll bring our Stata window over here behind that. So you could just click execute. And what this will do, you can see there's a lot of code here. We go through 2 waves of Charles that are currently available, and we create a really user-friendly data set. you notice that in that raw data we downloaded, there were maybe 10 files for each wave of Charles, and we're going to create one fat file, which is one file to use for all of Charles. While we're doing that, let's talk about how you know what's in this data set that we're creating. So if we go to our website again, we can go back to the downloads page. You can also see that we have download harmonized codebook. So we can click on harmonized Charles codebook here, and we're going to download this harmonized Charles codebook. The codebooks are extremely important. They're really helpful. So this is the harmonized Charles codebook, and you can go through it here. I'm going to actually open this in Acrobat so that we can use some of the more features that are helpful. So you can see here on the side we have bookmarks, and this is kind of the best way to find your way through this. Of course, you can just search, but you can also do these. So you can see, for instance, here's a section on the identifiers that are included in this data set. We have interview status, so whether the person wasn't interviewed yet, whether they're alive. This is wave 1, wave 2. And if you're not familiar with the harmonized data sets, you can kind of see here some of our variable naming conventions, which help to make this data set very user-friendly. So interview status in wave 1 is in a variable titled R1 IWStat, and interview status in wave 2 is called R2 IWStat. And then we also include spouse versions of most variables. So if you want to look between, if you only, for instance, are interested in looking in respondents and their spouses who are both included in the wave, you could easily kind of do that without doing spouse matching on your own. So we're going to be using this documentation throughout. Let's check on how our program is running here. Okay, great. So we finished the program. We've got a note here stating file C drive hcharles.dta saved. So that's perfect. We can also check our folder. We can confirm, so in hcharles, yeah. So we've got a data set there in hcharles called hcharles.dta. So that's perfect. All right. So that's our first step. The next step is we want to identify relevant variables. So for our question, we're going to pick 1 year of interest. We're not going to look at 2 years. So we're just going to look at 2011, which was wave 1 of Charles. So remember that our question is, are there gender differences in cognition, and are these differences consistent across all age groups? So in picking our relevant variables, we're going to need a measure of cognition. We're going to use a gender identifier to look over gender. We're going to need an age identifier. And we're going to need an analysis weight. And that's because we want to look over, we want to make a population estimate. Not just a report of the sample, but to look at the weight also, so we can have a population estimate for Charles. So here I have listed out the variable names that we're going to be using. But let's say you didn't know these. So I'll talk about 2 ways to kind of find these. The first will be on the website, and the second one is using the codebook. So if we jump back to our website here, kind of one of the easiest ways to find relevant survey variables is through our concordance search. So for instance, we could click on harmonized Charles here. This is the data set we're going to be using. We're going to be looking in the 2011 wave, so we'll click this button. And then we could then say we need an age at interview variable, we need a gender variable, we need some kind of summary score for cognition, and we also need a weight. So let's find analysis weight. There we go. And we can search through that. And so here we get a list of these variables that would kind of apply to what we're looking to. You can see here that we have 3 different kinds of weights in Charles, and we'll talk about what those mean. Here we've got our age variable, we've got our gender variable, which is perfect, and then it looks like we've got a cognition variable here called R1TR20, which is a recall summary score, so we can look at that. If you wanted more information about any of these, I'd always suggest using the codebook. So for instance, if we use the codebook, let's look at age at interview. So here's that variable we saw before, R1AGEY, and it runs from in wave 1 from 21 to 101. So one of the things you might notice there is maybe you thought, hey, aren't we looking at retirement age populations? And we are. But Charles also includes the spouses regardless of their age. So we're going to have, so there's someone who is age eligible for Charles in here, whose partner is 21. So we have that. So we know here about age. Here's a little more information about how age is calculated. We can look at our gender variable here. And because it's a categorical variable, we've got the values listed out. So a 1 is male, 2 is female. It looks like we have 4 people who we've got a missing report for gender and 1 person who refused to give gender. So that's our gender variable. And now let's look at our cognition variable. Again, remember it was called total recall score. So R1 TR20, this is our recall summary score. And here in this how constructed text, we can find out a little bit more about this. So R1 TR20 is the summary score for total word recall. RW TR20 sums the immediate and delayed word recall scores. It is calculated as, and this is a variable for the immediate word recall score and the delayed word recall score. And it's only calculated when the respondent has a non-missing value for these 2 variables. So if one of those is missing, it's not calculated. So we could click into, say, immediate word recall to find out more about this, how this is worked. So Charles includes a recall list of 10 different words which were read to a respondent when the respondent was asked to recall them immediately and later in the survey. So how this cognition test works is the respondent says, I'm going to read you 10 words. I'm going to ask you to repeat them now, and then I'm going to ask you some other questions. I'm going to ask you to repeat them later. And this is one measure of cognition. And this is a measure of cognition which is asked pretty consistently in different studies. So it's one that's often used if you're comparing different studies, and so that's nice. But I will say it doesn't capture all parts of cognition. So we'll be talking, I'll be referring to kind of this cognitive score, and we're going to be referring to this word recall score each time. But it's not a measure that incorporates all aspects of cognition, certainly. And so finally, let's look at our weight variable. So here's our person level analysis weight. So you can see here we have quite a few weights. Our first one here is an individual weight without any non-response adjustment. We have an individual weight with household non-response adjustment, and an individual weight with household and individual non-response adjustment. I cannot tell you which weight you want to use for your analysis, nor would Charles. These 3 weights are provided, these 3 main weights are provided to be able to give you, which weight you're going to use. Really depends on your research question and the things that you're interested in. For the example that we're using today, I'm going to be using this R1TR ETSB, so this individual weight that accounts for non-response at a household level and non-response at the individual level. For your own research, you might not want to use that one. You might want to use one of these other weights. All right, so we've got our variables of interest there. We've got all of these. We understand them. So we're going to create one additional variable. And we're going to look at age kind of in categorical terms as opposed to age in age as a continuous measure. Just sort of be a little bit easier to conceptualize differences in this cognitive score over different age groups. So here you can see here I've got this data code that we'll be looking at. Let's jump back to our Stata window. And now we can go File. We're going to use that do file that we saved earlier. So we can go File, Do. We can navigate. I've got my program, my folder here called Webinar Programs. And I've got this as Part 1, harmonizedcharles.do. And I can just open this directly. So let's click Open. So the first thing that we do here is we just want to check our variables, make sure they look the same as they looked in the code book. Everything seems to be running. So there's our cognition measure. If you're using this program, I've got on your own computer, your own Stata setup, I've got pauses set into this program. So you don't have to type any of your own Stata code if you have the do file. You'll just jump to the next step. And you do that by just typing Q and pressing Enter. So that's the only Stata code that you'll need to know to make it through the rest of the webinar if you're following along with the do files on your own Stata machine. So we're going to check our gender variable. Again, you see we've got male, female, we've got missing gender and refused gender, just like we saw before in the code book. Here we look at our age variable and we sum this and give some detail here. We don't tab it because it's not a categorical variable yet. We will make our age categorical variable. You can see we still got that smallest of 21. We've got a median age of 58 and our mean age is 58.6. So that looks good. And then we're going to create our age categorical variable. And so again, we do this using this data code here. eGen, if you're not familiar, is kind of, gen is a very typical, that's how you initialize a variable inside of Stata. And eGen is an enhanced type of variable initiation. And it allows for different options like this cut. So we're going to cut our respondent wave 1 age in years variable. And we're going to cut it at 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, all the way up to 101. So Charles' sampling eligibility starts at 45. So for this analysis, we're going to actually ignore all those younger spouses because we really want to say something. We're going to produce a population estimate for the Charles target sample population. And so we're going to use these 5-year spans. And then we can also specify this label option, which when you tab it, it's just going to give you these labels, which is 45 and over, 50, to, in this case 50 to 54, 55 and over, 60 and over, 65 and over, 70 and over, and then 75 all the way up to our highest age groups. And if we look here at the frequencies, we can see we've got a really, the largest groups are here in the 45 to 59 section, and they're a little bit smaller, but they look like we have a decent size there, so more than 1,000 people in all the groups, which is good. We should be able to say something about those age groups. So in our next step, we're going to apply our analysis weights. So Stata is really great for using survey data, and then particularly survey data which has complex sampling. And it's because they have this kind of built-in set of commands which are initialized with this svset command, svy set. And this allows you to actually to account for things like clustering and stratification and how they set up their sampling, which are really important because you can your standard errors will get confused because all of these samples use mostly all of them, I should say, use some amount of stratification or clustering so that they don't have to randomly interview everyone in the country, but they focus on an area which makes the sampling more affordable. In the case of Charles, Charles does not provide their stratification or clustering variables in their main data set, so we can't account for that here. But we're going to use svset, and then we're going to use the probability weight, and this is the probability weight that we looked at before. And this is that B version of the weight, which accounts for household and individual non-response. And so once we enter this command, then anytime that we use, that we calculate an estimate, that we say we can tell Stata to remember how we set up the sampling for this analysis. So if we jump back in to our Stata window and type Q, we can apply our weight there. We can also step through one more time. So we apply our weight there. We can see that our P weight is listed. We don't have a kind of single unit because we're not getting that information yet about stratification or clustering. And then you can see here that our VCE, because we've applied a P weight, Stata automatically assumes that there's going to be some issue with the standard errors, and so these standard errors that it produces are going to be linearized, which is the robust standard error. So that's another thing that Stata is kind of doing for you automatically. So our first step in our analysis is we're going to analyze cognition across genders. So we're going to estimate mean cognition for the entire population, the Chinese population. Again, this is age 45 and over, right? That's what we're looking at. You can see here's this data code that we'll use to do that. we use this svy colon, and that's how we recall what we set in the svy set command. So svy, mean, and then we're going to use our summary cognition score for word recall here. So if you step through here, you can see that overall we get a mean of 7.428, 8854. So what that tells us is that we would estimate that the average Chinese person in our age group of 45 and older is between these two different word lists, between immediate word recall and delayed recall, is going to remember a little over 7 of these words. You can also see here we've got our linearized standard errors. So these are robust standard errors, which is good. It takes into already account some of the issues that you have with complex survey design. And we've got here 95% confidence interval. So that's great. So again, in the next step, we can estimate mean cognition for males age 45 and over. And this can be a little tricky. Let's see, I just got a question here from Hugh Cheng. In order to get the correct standard errors, should PSU and stratum variables be used in SVY set? Absolutely. If they are available, they should absolutely be used. Unfortunately, not every study makes them available. So in the cases that they are available, they should absolutely be used. In the case of this Charles data, Charles has not released them, so they can't be used. So we're going to estimate mean cognition for males, and then again we'll estimate mean cognition for females. So again, we're going to use this SVY. We're going to recall how we set up our survey design. And then as opposed to just putting a regular condition on it, like we could say SVY mean if RA gender is equal to 1, remember, and our RA gender variable, 1 was males, 2 was females. We're going to use this subpop option, and this is really important because of how it's adjusting for the weighting, that you really want to refine your weights, so looking at just those weights which are referring, in this case, to males. So you need to specify our subpopulation, and then you can write the condition here. So if RA gender is equal to 1, we'll produce the same mean. And then we can also do SVY. Again, we'll do subpop if only females, right? So we're going to produce a mean which is only for females, but also takes into the weight more correctly, looking at just females. So we'll jump back to our Stata window. We can type Q here for our males, so we can see our mean is 7.52, which is a tiny bit higher than our total mean, let's step through and look at our mean for females. So our mean for females is 7.33. So it looks like there's a tiny bit of difference there between those. If we wanted to actually compare, we could actually test. We could do a test here about whether the two gender estimates are significantly different. So there we've kind of produced, currently produced two different estimates, but not together. And you could use maybe the confidence intervals to get an idea of whether there's any overlap, of whether the 7.33 is overlapping with the 7.45. It looks like there's probably a little bit of overlap. But let's say we want to really do a test, to get a p-value there. So how you're going to do this is actually a little bit simpler than looking at the individual groups. So we're going to do SVY. Again, we're going to take our mean for our cognitive summary score of total word recall. And in this case, we're going to specify an option which is over RA gender. And what that's going to do is in the same step, it's going to look at males and females together. It'll give us two estimates. And then what we can do is we can test the difference in those estimates. Stata will default here to a walled test. And so the code that you use to do this is test. We're going to name our variable. Subpopulation 1 is equal to name the variable we're looking at again, subpopulation 2. So let's go through Stata. We'll type Q here in Stata, and we'll jump to our next test. You can see we do an adjusted walled test for this. And we get our probability greater than F is 0.03. So maybe a little bit of significance, but not very significant difference. If we wanted to look at this graphically, here's what our test would look like. I'm not going to be talking about generating graphs, but I just think these graphs are helpful as we get further into this analysis. We'll be looking at a lot of different groups, so graphs are really helpful. So you can see here in our confidence intervals that at least the 95% confidence interval, these are not statistically significantly different, though males are a tiny bit higher on average. So that's somewhat interesting. So then let's go back to the second part of our, the second analysis we're going to do in part one. So let's analyze cognition across genders and age groups. So we've seen that there's not a much difference if you look at ages 45 to 110, right, end of life. But there could be differences in different age groups. So let's look at that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to estimate mean cognition for each gender age group. And that's, again, this data is really nice because this is really simple. So again, we're just going to use our SVY. We'll recall our sampling design. We're going to take the mean of our cognitive score. And in this case, we're going to go over RA gender and over R1 AGECAT. And that's the variable that we created with our age categories. So there in that one step, we've done that. And then we can test the difference for the youngest group. So we'll test subpop 1, which is the youngest males, versus subpop 2, which is youngest females. I'll tell you about, when we look at this data, you'll see how I'm getting these numbers. It lists them out for you. And then we'll test the difference for the oldest groups. So subpop 7 here is our oldest males, and subpop 14 is our oldest females. So back in this data, we can type Q. You can see here we get a lot more groups. Again, if you scroll up, it gives you the over categories. So we can see subpop 1 is males 45 to 49. Subpop 8 is 45 females who are 45 to 49. And then our oldest age group for males is subpop 7 and subpop 14. And I'm just picking, you could compare each of these age groups. I just kind of want to see if there's a difference overall. We can look at our means down here to kind of get an idea, and then we'll look at this graphically. So our mean for our youngest males here, so 45 to 49, is 8.6. And youngest females, it's 8.4. So they don't look that much different. So let's look at our oldest age groups here. So subpop 7 is 5.8. One of the things you'll notice is that these cognitive scores do go down as people get older. So that's for our males, and for females it's 4.5. So that actually looks like a more significant difference, or a larger difference at this point, let's say, than we saw for our youngest age groups. And let's look at this graphically. And this is just what we saw on this last screen, just put in graphical form. Yeah, so we can see here for our youngest age group, we're not seeing much difference, and it's definitely not statistically significantly different. You know, what we do see, and we really don't see any difference, right, all the way even to 70 to 74. What we really do see is by 75 and older, there is a statistically significant difference. And you could refer to the paper, you know, the paper that I cited that we're kind of redoing a little bit of this analysis, talks about what's driving some of those differences, which is interesting. So that's part one. That's our analysis using harmonized Charles. And now we're going to kind of look at this analysis comparing our results here for the Chinese population to the U.S. population. So let's get started on that. Oh, we have to run our adjusted wall test, so we can just check these things here. I forgot about this. So the significance of difference for the youngest age group, again, we're seeing it's not at all statistically significantly different. And for our oldest age group, we're seeing, yes, as we saw on the graph, it's statistically significantly different. So that's the end of our first file. I'm going to clear out this data, so we'll just do clear all. That'll clear the data set. I've got no variables left in this data right now. And I'm going to open up our second do file. And I'm going to do that in the do file editor. So before we went file do, which is a fine way to go through this. But let's open up the do file editor, and this is kind of a second way to look at a do file if you want to edit the do file itself. And then we can open, and we can open our advanced webinar part 2 cross-country.do. So you can see here we've got the code. Again, I've got these pauses set in, so the only thing you would have to type if you're following along is Q and return. I need to list a location for the RAND HRS. So I've got that saved on my computer, again on my C drive, in a folder called HRS, rand HRS. And we know where our harmonized Charles folder is, right? We remember that. So Charles, and we've got H underscore Charles. Let me just check here and make sure. Yep, H underscore Charles. And if we jump back up in our C drive, we can look at our HRS folder, and it's called rand underscore HRS. So I need the underscore in there. There we go. So I've got this all loaded in. I could then just save this, and we can start to run it. Before we do that, let's talk about what we're going to, some of the things that we're going to be considering. So we're going to see if, are there gender differences in cognition, are these gender differences in cognition? So we did see some in Charles. Are these consistent across countries? And in particular, are they different in China versus in the US? You know, do we see the same kind of difference where maybe younger age groups in the US don't have any difference, and older age groups have a significant difference? And are males usually always a little bit higher than females, and statistically significantly higher at the oldest age group in the US? So we're going to identify relevant variables in the rand HRS. We know which variables are going to be used in the harmonized Charles. We're going to create a pooled data set with variables from both harmonized data sets. Sometimes this is also called a stacked data set. So, and I kind of like the word stacked because we're going to pull in the harmonized Charles variables, and then underneath them, we're going to put the rand HRS variables, observations and variables. We're going to prepare those variables, so we might have to create a few additional variables. We might have to adjust for some differences in the variable names. We're going to apply our weights, and then we're going to analyze cognition across genders and ages for each country. So our identify relevant variables in the rand HRS. So our year of interest for the rand HRS, we're going to pick 2010, which is HRS wave 10. You remember Charles was conducted in 2011, but we're just picking 2010 because it is closest. We're going to need a measure of cognition. Luckily, the rand HRS has the exact same measure. You'll notice that in the HRS, 2010 is wave 10 of the HRS, whereas 2011 is wave 1 of the HRS. So our variable name here for cognition is R10, TR20. So one of the things we'll need to do is we'll need to make our variable names consistent across waves. You know, maybe we can make them year-specific, have a year-specific variable name instead of a wave-specific variable name. We've got our gender variable, RA gender, which is not wave-specific, so that's absolutely looks the same. We've got an age identifier, so R10 AGEY underscore E. You'll notice it has an underscore E on it, which is different, and that's because the HRS actually identifies a beginning age and an end age in case over the course of the interview perhaps someone aged, and we're going to use end age there as probably the most comparable to the age that we have in Charles. And then our analysis weight, which is R10 WTRESP. So those are our variables. If you wanted to know more about any of these variables or help find them, again, you could use the concordance search, or you could use the rand HRS codebook, which you could download here from our download page under download harmonized codebook, the rand HRS codebook. And you could find more about that. Now you could also see whether there were any differences. I've already done this, so we know there's not too many differences there. So we've got those. And so then we want to create a few additional variables. So we're going to create a pooled data set with variables from both harmonized data sets. So that's the first thing. We're going to make this stacked data set. So here's how we do this. So first we're going to use, and in this case we're not going to pull in all of the variables. You know, for our first example, we already had the harmonized Charles, the entire data set loaded into our Stata program, into the Stata memory. But in this case, we're just going to pull in those variables that we want. And this is helpful, especially because the rand HRS is an absolutely massive, I mean, there's 12 waves of data in the rand HRS, or 11 waves currently in the rand HRS. So it's really massive, and depending on which version of Stata you have, it might not be able to hold the whole thing in memory at once. But what we can do is we can just specify those variables that we want to pull in and kind of make an analysis data set. So we're going to have this stacked or pooled analysis data set. So here we're going to use, and we specify the 4 variables that we're interested in from the RAIN-HRS. The current version is version o.dta. Again, if you don't have the RAIN-HRS, you could visit the Gateway to Global Aging Data, and you can download the RAIN-HRS dataset. This would take you to the University of Michigan site, where you can easily download the RAIN-HRS data. Again, you would need to register independently with the HRS datasite, and you could download that. It's really simple, and again, it's extremely quick. I don't think there's any delay, actually, once you sign up. And we want to be able to identify which observations are from which country or which data set. So we're going to make, so once we pull in our HRS variables, we're going to make a variable called country, and we're going to give it the value of 840. So currently there's only respondents in our data set from the HRS. So we're going to assign them this value of 840. 840, if you're not familiar, is the ISO code, which is how I tend to label countries for the US. And then we're going to append. So this is how we're going to create our stack data set. So we're going to append using our H. Charles data. And in this case, we're going to say keep. And this is from this H. Charles data set. We're going to keep, again, our 4 variables here of interest that we identified and that we used in part 1 of the webinar. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to generate an append variable. So this append variable will tell you whether the observations that got pulled in, whether they were from this recently appended data set or they were already in the data set. So we can use that to identify all of our Charles observations. So using this append variable, we can say replace country is equal to 156. 156 is the ISO code for China. So if append is equal to 1. So let's jump into Stata, and we'll actually do that. Again, we need to go to our do file editor. So to run from the do file editor, you can just click this button up here, which is execute.do. So let's just click that. So the first thing we do is we read in our RAIN-HRS variables. If you opened the variable viewer, you could see we've got our 4 variables from the RAIN-HRS, and we've got our country identifier, which we created. You could type Q, and we're going to append, which means we're going to stack. So we're going to put all those Charles observations below our RAIN-HRS observations, and we're going to replace country. Again, if we check our variables window, we can see here we've got the 3 variables that we added from Charles, which have Charles names which are different from the RAIN-HRS variable names. We didn't get another gender variable because that name's automatically the same, which just means for all those values for Charles respondents, it gets automatically put under that variable which we were already created before. So we've got our variables, so that's great. Our next step is we're going to add labels to our country identifier just so that our estimates look a little better. So we can say label define ISO, 156 is China and 840 is USA, and then we can label values country ISO. So this is a simple step. And we can tab this country. So you can see we've got 21,000 respondents or observations from China and 37,000 from the US. Now these are observations across all the waves, right? Because we have one data set which represents all respondents. So this variable would actually be different if we looked across just the waves that we're considering, this 2010-2011 waves, and we'll get to that. So next we need to adjust for differing wave numbers in variable names. So if you remember in Stata, so the variable names which are different here, let's see, we need to adjust for our age at interview because we've got 2 different names that. We need to adjust for our weight. We've got different names for our weights, and for our total recall summary score because those are all wave specific. So they've got different variable names. So we can do this by, let's say, we're going to use a year specific variable name here. So we're going to gen our 2010 COG. That's going to be our cognitive summary score. We're going to replace our 2010 COG is equal to R10 TR20 if country. So we're going to use that country variable, that identifier, which is really important. So if they're in the US, we'll assign them this value for this variable. And if they're in China, if they're from the Charles, if they're a Charles respondent, we'll assign them this variable. We'll kind of do exactly the same for weight. So in this case, we didn't use a year-specific variable name. We just called it weight. So gen weight, again, exactly the same thing. And then we'll do it once more for our age variable. So gen 2010 age variable, and it's equal to 2010 or R to R10 AGEY underscore E if from the RAIN-HRS, and R1 AGY if from the harmonized Charles dataset. We can queue through here. So you can see here we've added these 3 variables, so that's perfect. So we've got our variable names worked out. We will also still need to create an age category, just like we did before. So here's the kind of very similar code to what we saw in the in part 1. One thing that you might notice is that instead, in Charles we started at 45, right? So the HRS doesn't start until people who are over the age of 50. So it starts at 51. So we want to make sure that we're comparing the same age groups and that we can compare the same age groups. And all of the studies have, there's somewhat difference in the different age eligibility. If you go back to our website, under the Surveys at a Glance page, we have a study overview tab. And this can be helpful if you're just wondering about the age eligibility. Of course, this is in all of the code books also, but we have one table here that highlights the different age eligibilities. So HRS starts at 51. Mexico, the MHAS and the Mexican survey starts at 50. The Korean survey starts at 45, just like the Chinese survey. So it's really important to remember when you're looking at this. Ola asks, why did you use the egen command for age categories and not gen? So you could absolutely use gen to create this, but you would have to take a couple steps. So you'd have to say, gen our age variable, and then you could say replace the age variable is equal to 1 if the age is between 51 and 54, and then another line replace if between 55 and 59. And the nice thing about using this egen command is that kind of in one step, it creates all those categories for you, and it automatically applies labels. So it's just a little bit of a quicker way to program inside of Stata. You could absolutely create this just with the gen command. It would maybe be 7 lines of code instead of 1. So if we can code simpler and cleaner, that's always nice. So that's why I use the egen command. So let's actually apply that in Stata. So here's we've got our age categorical variable here. So we've got our groups, so 51 to 54, and then after that 4-year age group, we've got 5-year age groups, just like before. So that's perfect. We've got all our variables set up. Now let's talk about weighting. So one of the things that you would probably assume is that how weights are produced are different in different countries. And that's absolutely true. And so that's one of the things that we need to take into account. So although we made this weight variable, we need to tell Stata that the weight variable is different for different groups, that the weight variable for the HRS respondents is not exactly calculated the same as the weight variable for our Charles respondents. So we can do this by specifying here a strata. So we're going to say that our weight here is stratified by our country variable. Again, we're using that country identifier. So that will tell Stata, although everyone has a weight that has the same variable name, which is important to be able to look at this in one step, it allows Stata to adjust for that different weighting between different countries. So let's step through. We'll close our variable window for now. You can see here are our 2 strata, 156 and 840. Those are the codes, the ISO codes again, and you can see how many observations that we have in each that are weighted. So that's great, we've got that. And so in our next step, we're going to estimate, let's just estimate mean cognition for each country. And we'll just look at that, what that looks like. So we're going to say SVY, we're going to recall how we set up our complex sampling design. Again, saying that here's our weight variable, but it's different for different countries. And in this case, we really want to say we're going to use a subpop again, and that's because we want to make sure that we're comparing the same age groups. So I'm using this in-range condition, and if you're not familiar with distance data, it just says between the ranges listed here and a second and third argument for this variable as the first argument. So for anyone whose 2010 age is between 51, again, kind of our top age here is 110. We don't want to produce an estimate for other people. So before we use this subpop, we put gender in here, but since we're now using age, we want to put it in here also so to adjust for that in the weights. Because again, the Charles weights are going to include anyone who's 45 all the way up to 50, and the HRS weights don't, so we want to account for that. And then we're going to do our mean, our summary score with, again, this is the same summary score, and it's over, instead this time we're going to use country. So if we go back in this data here, what we can see is that for people who are 51 and over in China, we estimate that on average they'll remember right about 7 words, and for the US, they'll remember right about 10 words, which is interesting, right? You see a big difference there. We can also look at this graphically. You can see there seems to be quite a big difference, and certainly a statistically significant difference. I do want to say it's hard to interpret this difference, right? So there could be a lot of different things which are driving this. And so as opposed to, what most people do when they compare different countries is that they look in difference in differences as opposed to just looking at a difference. And so we'll talk about that. So it's not terribly interesting or explainable to say, oh, well, people in the US are able to remember on average 3 more words than people in China who are 51 and older. But what might be more interesting is to say is that, hey, the gender difference or the age difference, the age gradient that we see in China is different than the age gradient that we see in the US. And that's kind of this difference in differences. So we're saying, here's a difference that's in Charles, and how is that different than what we see in the HRS? That's called differences in differences. And that's often how people kind of look at these papers, and it gives you a kind of it's something more interesting to say, really, and you can talk more about kind of the theory about why we would just see these different differences across different countries, as just to oppose saying, hey, in the US it's higher and in China it's lower. So our next up, let's look at one of these differences in differences. So we're going to analyze cognition across country and gender. So again, our command here is going to look exactly the same, really, except in this over option, we're going to say country and RA gender. So we'll look at males in the US, females in the US, males in China, females in the US. And we can see if we see a gender difference there. You will remember from part 1 that we didn't see a statistically significant gender difference, at least for males and females aged 45 and older, right, on average, in the Charles data set, or in the Chinese population. So let's see, we're sort of changing our scope a little bit by looking at people 51 and over. So we'll confirm whether that's still true for this age group in Charles, and we'll see what it looks like for the US. So you can see here our subpop 1 is males in China, our subpop 2 is females in China, subpop 3 is males in the US, and subpop 4 is females in the US. So our mean score here is 7.2 for Chinese males, 6.8 for Chinese females, 9.2 for males in the US, and 10.5 for females in the US. So interestingly, females are actually here higher in the US, and we can look at this graphically. So here's what this looks like graphically. So what you can see is that, as we saw before, the US is higher, but one of the interesting things that we see is that this difference in the US is statistically significant. Females are higher on average in this age group, and in China it looks like males are on average a little bit higher, but not statistically significantly higher. I've got one question here from Mina Chuchu. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Could there be differences due to the different age-sex distribution of the two countries? Wouldn't the score need to be age-adjusted? And yes, so that's absolutely true. So there are, of course, differences in sex distribution. There's also differences in age distributions, and there's differences in longevity that you might think about. You know, are we seeing older people in one of these countries than the other? So these are, you know, those are, you really picked a couple really interesting things that we'll actually be looking at, that it might be more interesting to talk about those differences. You know, if we say just looking at, for instance, people who are 50 to 55 in China, males 55 to 55 in China versus females 55 to 55 in China, 50 to 55 in China, versus those same age groups in the U.S. So that's absolutely one of the reasons that just saying one difference between one country and another is less interesting, because you really need to try to derive what's going on there. So here we've got our last step. So we're going to do exactly what you suggested. We're going to analyze cognition across genders and ages for each country, right? So genders and ages. Again, this is really simple. So in our over option here, we're just going to add in our age categorical variable. You also notice that we'll drop our subpopulation, that they're all in the age group that's covered by both surveys. And that's because once we add in this age categorization variable, if they're not categorized in that, they automatically drop out of our analysis. So we don't have to specify that again. And then we can test the difference for the youngest group in China, and we can test the difference for the youngest group in the US. And then we can test the difference for the oldest group in China and the difference for the youngest group in China and the oldest group in the US. So let's go back to this data, and we'll kind of go through our final step here. So you can see we get a lot of groups, right? And just because we've really split this up, we kind of have 3 dimensions here. One is the country you're from, one is your gender, and one is your age group. So we've got 24 total groups. So you can see here our youngest group of males in China, 51 to 54. Here they have an average score of 7.78, and then females in China is subpop 7, so 7.8. Again, seeing not that much difference. And then our youngest group of males in the U.S. is subpop 13, and their average is 10.44. And then for youngest group of females in the U.S. is subpop 19, and that's 11, right? So it looks like there's some difference there, although maybe smaller than what we saw overall. And then we can step through and do our tests. So we'll first test the significance of difference for the youngest age group. So 1 versus 7. We can see that it's not a statistically significant difference. We can test it for the youngest age group in the U.S. We can see that it definitely looks like a statistically significant difference. And if you remember from before, females were actually higher than males. We can go through. We can look at the significant difference for the oldest age group in China. Again, here the difference, as we saw in part 1, is statistically significantly different. And in this case, males are higher. And then for the oldest age group in the U.S., you can see, again, it's very statistically significantly different. And again, females are higher. So let's just look at this graphically. So here we have our chart. So you can see a couple different things here. So we can look at gender differences, we can look at differences in country, and then we can look at kind of gradients over ages, which is really nice here. So what we see is we confirmed here that for our youngest group in China, really no differences very much. For our oldest age group, again, here we do see that males are a lot higher and statistically significantly different. For our youngest group in the U.S., females are statistically significantly higher. And then you can actually see this is throughout all age groups in the U.S. You can see that that females are statistically significantly higher in this cognitive summary score. One of the other things that's kind of interesting here is in the U.S. you really don't see any decline overall for our age groups here. I would really say until after 69, you see a little bit of decline starting in 70, and then a little bit more decline in 75 and older, of course, a more significant decline there. And there's really a more gradual decline looking at our Chinese population here. So that's also another difference. So we have this differences in genders and the difference in kind of how things happen over ages. So Barbara asks, would you apply any correction for multiple testing in these analysis? So multiple testing, Are you referring to whether whether the cognitive test was done multiple times? If you could let me know that, I could probably answer that question a little bit better. KK Kim asks, hi Tristan, is there a need to standardize the age if the data come from different years? For example, add 1 year for respondents in the HRS so that it reflects the age in 2011, same year as Charles, or -1 from the age of those respondents in Charles to match the age of 2010. And that's a great question, and that's something, yeah, you caught on to something that I didn't do. So I'm taking for granted that 2010 and 2011 are really quite similar. And it could be, based on what you're looking at, I might not expect any big changes in cognition, but depending on what you're looking at, you can see, especially if you're looking at maybe economic variables and there's an economic decline that happens in 1 year from another, and you think that it happened globally at the same time, that you might want to correct those ages. So that's absolutely true. And Barbara, you replied back, the last test command. So would you apply any correction for multiple testing in these analysis? So in the last test command here, let's jump back. So here's the last test command. So maybe I'm not totally sure what you're asking, and it could just be that I'm not familiar with the multiple testing, but I don't think that you need to apply any correction beyond testing in this, because really we're testing the two groups independently of the other groups. Our tests are not overlapping. So that wraps it up for today. I'll say a little bit just about the gateway and for getting any more help. We have a help page here at the gateway. And so we have some frequently asked questions and some instructions for common tasks. Also, if you have any more questions, you can always email us at help@g2aging.com, and we'll get back to you. Always, we try within 24 hours. So if you have any questions, that's a great way to get in contact with us. Also, if you'd like, if you're watching this webinar after it, and so it's not live, if you'd like to download the data files that I referenced during the presentation, you can do that from our documentation page here. Later today, I'll add recent presentations, and I'll include the slides, a link to the webinar, and both data codes that we used today. Also, as we finish this webinar, once you log off, you'll be there's a brief survey. Would appreciate if you filled out, just to let us know if there's things we could improve about this webinar or not. I appreciate you filling this out, and I hope you enjoyed this and found this helpful, and we're always wanting more advice. So I'll hang out for a couple, as long as need be, and answer questions, but this will wrap up the formal portion of our webinar. Thank you all for joining.